Imagine being told that you have exactly 90 days to pack up your company's entire physical data center and just, move it completely into the cloud.
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario for most IT teams.
Right. I mean, we are talking hundreds of servers, petabytes of data, decades of legacy code. And you have to migrate all of it to AWS without dropping a single packet of data or taking the company offline.
And absolutely no multi-year planning committees to hide behind.
Exactly. No leisurely phased rollouts. Just a ticking clock and a mandate to get it done. So today we're doing a deep dive into the brutal physics of a 90-day AWS migration constraint.
Because it really does change the physics of how a business operates.
It really does. And if you are listening to this right now, you're likely a learner who, occasionally stares down a massive professional or intellectual hurdle of your own.
Yeah.
You might be managing a project right now that feels impossibly compressed.
Which is incredibly common, honestly.
So our mission today is to explore this highly specific, incredibly high-stakes scenario extracted straight from our source material. The sources dictate that navigating this kind of corporate sprint really hinges on a methodology called the 7 R's framework.
Right, which helps you make those ruthless choices about what to prioritize.
Yeah, and maybe more importantly, how to avoid the invisible tripwires that can completely tank the operation on, like day 89. So, okay, let's unpack this, because an enterprise IT migration is traditionally a massive, heavily deliberated endeavor.
Oh, absolutely. Usually it's, well, you assess, you form committees, you delay things.
You provision overlapping budgets.
Yeah.
But a strict 90-day timeline fundamentally alters the nature of the beast. Without that deadline, this is just a standard technology upgrade. With it, it's a high-stakes sprint.
It becomes a completely different animal.
It's like moving from a house you've owned and customized for decades into this massive, hypermodern, rented smart mansion. So I have to push back right out of the gate here.
Sure, go for it.
Can a complete structural move from an on-premise footprint to AWS genuinely be executed in 3 months without just catastrophic downtime? Or is a 90-day timeline inherently setting an engineering team up for complete operational chaos?
What's fascinating here is how the constraint itself actually becomes the catalyst for success.
Wait, really? The constraint helps.
Yeah, it does. You mentioned the usual multi-year timeline and the endless planning committees. Well, in enterprise project management, we are constantly battling Parkinson's law.
Ah, right. The idea that work expands to fill the time allotted for it.
Exactly. If you give an enterprise 3 years to migrate to AWS, they will take all 3 years. They'll spend tens of millions of dollars on consultants, and they will probably still be scrambling to hit the final cutover in month 35.
That sounds painfully accurate.
Right. But when you compress that exact same objective into a 90-day window, you force the team to completely abandon the luxury of perfectionism. It shifts the entire nature of the initiative.
From like a theoretical architecture redesign to just pure survival.
Yes, to a highly disciplined, almost military-style execution.
So the constraint forces you to stop trying to build the ultimate pristine cloud environment. But doesn't that inherently mean you're going to make, terrible architectural decisions?
Well, it means you're going to make pragmatic decisions, and the psychology of that 90-day limit just removes the space for endless debate.
Right, you don't have time to argue.
But you're right to point out the risk, because the core friction here really comes down to cloud economics versus the speed of the migration.
Okay, how so?
Well, when you operate an on-premise data center, your compute habits are built around maximum capacity. You bought those servers, so you run your applications 24/7, consuming resources regardless of the actual demand.
Because it doesn't cost you extra to run them if you already own the metal.
Exactly. But AWS and cloud environments are designed to be highly elastic, You scale up when traffic hits and you scale down to 0 to save money when it doesn't.
Which is great in theory.
It is, but in a 90-day sprint, you rarely have the time to actually rewrite your applications to be elastic. You are essentially porting those expensive on-premise compute habits directly into an environment that charges you by the second.
Oh, wow. So your first AWS bill is going to be absolutely astronomical.
Oh, it will be painful.
Because you're running old monolithic software in a modern metered environment. You're just paying for maximum capacity all the time.
Exactly. That is the exact trade-off of the 90-day constraint. You are trading long-term operational cost efficiency for immediate migration speed.
So you just have to swallow that initial shock to the billing cycle just to hit the deadline.
Yeah, knowing you will have to optimize it later. And that brings us to how a team actually governs this chaos. Because even if you accept that you are going to be slightly inefficient, you still need a ruthless strategy.
To determine exactly what moves, what dies, and what gets rewritten.
Right? Precisely. You need a system.
Right. Which brings us to the methodology of the source material. Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources drop this massive, comprehensive categorization model on us called the 7Rs framework.
Yes, the famous 7Rs.
Now, looking at this, retain, retire, rehost, replatform, repurchase, refactor, and relocate, my immediate reaction is honestly just skepticism.
Oh, why is that?
Well, if you are bleeding time, expecting a team to sit around a whiteboard debating a 7-part decision tree for hundreds of applications seems completely counterproductive. Doesn't enforcing a heavy methodology during a sprint just create another bottleneck?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a framework like the 7Rs isn't meant to be a slow academic debate. It exists precisely to categorize decisions at warp speed.
So it's more about rapid sorting.
Think of it less like a philosophical framework and more like triage in a trauma ward. You don't write a 10-page thesis on every patient.
Right, you just figure out who needs surgery right now.
Exactly. You use a rigid system to instantly categorize their fate. The 7Rs act as that exact sorting mechanism. And in a 90-day sprint, you really group them by their time-cost trade-offs.
Okay, so where do you start?
The most critical group early on is what I'd call the art of subtraction. That is, retire and retain.
I assume retire just means killing off dead weight.
Yeah.
Like you look at a legacy internal tool that hasn't seen a login since 2019 and you just pull the plug instead of migrating it.
Precisely. Retire is your biggest time saver.
And retain.
Retain, on the other hand, is the decision to consciously ignore something for now. If you have, say, a massive complex compliance database that requires a 6-month legal review just to change its IP address.
Oh yeah, that cannot be part of a 90-day sprint.
No way. You retain it on-premise, you amputate it from the project scope entirely. By aggressively using retire and retain, a team might eliminate 20 to 30% of their workload before they even touch AWS.
Okay, the subtraction makes a lot of sense, but for the applications that actually must cross the chasm into AWS, how do you balance the friction between speed and actually utilizing the cloud properly?
That is where you hit the massive collision between two other Rs, Rehost and Refactor. Rehost is famously known as lift and shift.
Lift and shift, meaning you don't change anything.
Right. You take the application exactly as it exists today, monolithic architecture, bugs, inefficiencies, and all, and you just drop it onto an EC2 virtual instance in AWS. You don't touch the code at all.
It is the absolute fastest way to get out of your physical data center.
It is. But as we discussed with the cloud economics, rehosting is what guarantees that massive AWS bill.
Because you're just running an old clunker of a system on a hyper-modern highway.
Yeah.
So the alternative is refactoring, right?
Yes, refactoring is the gold standard. It means completely re-architecting the application to be cloud native.
Breaking it apart.
Exactly. Instead of moving one giant monolithic block of code where everything is intertwined, you are shattering it into dozens of independent microservices.
So you might use serverless architecture, like AWS Lambda or something.
Yeah, so code only executes, and you only pay when a specific function is triggered.
But shattering a monolith and rewriting the communication protocols between dozens of independent functions, I mean, that takes months, if not years, to untangle and test.
Which is exactly why refactoring is the absolute enemy of the 90-day sprint. It is a luxury you simply cannot afford.
So you just have to accept the ugly method.
You do. If an engineering team attempts to refactor their core applications during this window, they will inevitably fail the deadline. The friction of the 7Rs in this scenario is accepting that rehost, the ugly, expensive lift and shift method, will be the reality for 80% of your portfolio.
That's a tough pill to swallow for an engineer.
It is. You might sprinkle in a little bit of replatforming, say swapping out your old on-premise database for a fully managed Amazon RDS database, but mostly you are lifting and shifting.
What about the internal apps that are just, too brittle to even lift and shift, the ones held together by digital duct tape? Do we just leave them behind?
That's where repurchase acts as a pressure release valve. You abandon your old custom software entirely and simply buy a modern SaaS product.
Oh, software as a service, like dumping your old HR tool and migrating the data to Workday.
Exactly. Or you drop your old CRM and move to Salesforce. You don't migrate the infrastructure at all. You just migrate the data to someone else's infrastructure.
So by aggressively stripping out the noise with retire and retain, relying heavily on the speed of Rehost, utilizing repurchase to dump the hopeless apps, and strictly forbidding the temptation to refactor, you suddenly have a clear, actionable roadmap.
Yes, the triage is complete.
The theoretical phase is closed.
Exactly. Now, you actually have to execute the move.
And execution is where I imagine the real bloodbath happens. Because even with a map, you still have to decide what goes across the wire first. We have our applications categorized, but what is the actual sequence?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, the instinct for a lot of project managers, I imagine, is to build momentum. You want to secure some quick wins.
Naturally. You want to show progress.
Right. You grab the lightweight internal blogs, the static websites, the isolated marketing apps that don't have messy dependencies, and you migrate them in the first 2 weeks. The board sees progress, the team high-fives, and you establish a rhythm.
This raises an important question. Does rushing the easiest services to AWS first create a false sense of security?
I assume you're going to say yes.
I am. The source material heavily debates this prioritization strategy, and I would argue that going for the quick, easy wins is one of the most dangerous traps in a compressed timeline.
Wait, I have to challenge that. If you pick a massive, deeply complex application for your first wave and it fails, haven't you just blown 30 days of your 90-day window on a completely failed experiment?
It feels that way, sure.
You've demoralized the team, and you have absolutely nothing to show the executives. Why not start small, just to verify your network pipes and access controls actually work?
Because migrating a static website doesn't actually verify your architecture. It verifies that you know how to copy and paste files.
Ouch. Fair point.
If you spend the first 45 days of your sprint migrating the easy 20% of your infrastructure, your burn-down charts look amazing. You feel like you are way ahead of schedule.
But it's an illusion.
A total illusion. You have merely delayed the hardest 80%. When you finally hit day 70 and try to move the massive interdependent core databases, you suddenly realize your AWS network topology can't handle the data throughput.
Or your latency requirements are completely broken.
Exactly. And at day 70, you have zero buffer left to re-architect the network. You hit day 90, and the core business goes offline.
Okay, that makes sense. By avoiding the friction, you're masking the fatal flaws in your design until it's just too late to fix them. So what is the alternative? Do you move the heaviest, most terrifying legacy database first?
No, you move what we call a Pathfinder application.
Pathfinder. What does that look like?
You identify a highly representative slice of your architecture. It needs to be a middleweight, complex application that tests your security protocols, your network bandwidth, and your database connections.
But maybe isn't the single critical application that processes real-time financial transactions?
Exactly. You don't want to bet the entire company on the first move.
It's basically the canary in the coal mine, but a really robust, heavily armored canary.
Precisely. If you can get the Pathfinder working in AWS early in the 90 days, you have legitimately validated the core architecture for the rest of the monoliths.
You've uncovered the bottlenecks while you still have, like, 60 days to course correct.
Exactly.
Speaking of bottlenecks, the sources highlight one mistake as the absolute killer in a cloud migration: failing to map dependencies.
Oh, it is the silent killer of migrations.
Now, I understand that applications don't live in isolation. The web server talks to the authentication server. The HR app talks to the payroll database. But how does a team actually map these out when they only have 90 days?
It's incredibly difficult.
Especially with legacy systems where the original developer left a decade ago and literally nothing is documented.
This is where the migration feels like trying to change the tires on a car while it's driving at 80 miles per hour. You can't afford downtime to take everything apart and look at the wiring.
So what do you do?
In a modern approach, teams will deploy automated discovery tools. These are software agents installed on the on-premise servers that just monitor all the network traffic over a few weeks.
Okay, so they map out every IP address that server A talks to and what ports it uses to talk to server B.
Yes. So the tool builds a giant visual web of your entire digital ecosystem.
That sounds incredibly helpful.
It is, but here's the critical limitation. An automated tool can tell you that two servers are communicating, but it cannot tell you the business logic of why they are communicating.
Ah, right. It doesn't know context.
Exactly. The tool might flag that your legacy accounting app sends a ping to an unknown server every night at 2.0 A. The engineering team has to play detective while the clock is ticking to figure out if that ping is a critical nightly backup or if it's just a defunct script written by a guy named Gary in 2014 that can safely be deleted.
Gary's script. And if you guess wrong, let's say you migrate the accounting app to AWS, but leave that unknown server sitting on-premise because you didn't think it mattered.
Then you run headfirst into the latency trap. Let's say Gary's script actually handles user authentication. On-premise, those two servers sat right next to each other in the same physical rack.
So the data transfer took like a fraction of a millisecond.
Exactly. Now, the accounting app is in an AWS data center in Virginia, and the authentication server is still sitting in your basement in Chicago.
Oh, no.
Every single time a user clicks a button, the system has to travel across the public internet to verify the action. What used to take 2 milliseconds now takes 3 seconds.
Multiply that by thousands of clicks, and the application essentially grinds to a halt. The migration was technically successful, but the user experience is totally destroyed.
Which proves exactly why dependency mapping is so vital. If they talk to each other, they have to move together in the same wave.
You can't split a deeply coupled architecture across a continent.
Exactly. You migrate them as a single cohesive pod.
Okay, let's pivot to the other massive landmine in the execution phase, which is security. I have to imagine that when a team is staring down a 90-day deadline and the CEO is demanding results, security protocols are the very first things thrown out the window just to make the connections work.
It is honestly the single highest risk of a rapid migration, and it largely stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the AWS shared responsibility model.
How so?
Well, many executives falsely assume that because AWS is a massive, secure cloud provider, simply moving to AWS automatically secures their data. But AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud. They lock down the physical data centers, they patch the hypervisors, they secure the core network.
Right, but you, the customer, are responsible for security in the cloud.
Exactly.
Meaning AWS provides the reinforced concrete walls and the heavy-duty deadbolts, but it's entirely your fault if you leave the digital front door propped wide open while you are frantically moving your data inside.
That is a perfect analogy. And how that plays out technically during a 90-day sprint usually involves IAM identity and access management.
Permissions, basically.
Right. When you are rushing to get a migrated application to communicate with a new database in AWS, you will inevitably run into permissions errors. The app gets blocked.
And the developer is stressed, the deadline is looming.
Exactly. So instead of taking the time to write a finely tuned least privilege access policy, they just apply a wildcard permission.
Yikes. They grant the application administrative access to the entire environment just to make the error go away and keep the project moving.
Yep. And they tell themselves, I'll come back and lock down those permissions after the 90 days are up.
But they never do.
Never. Because on day 91, there is a new crisis. Those wildly permissive IAM roles become ticking time bombs. A few months later, a minor vulnerability in that single application is exploited. And because the app has wildcard administrative access, the attacker suddenly has the keys to the entire corporate kingdom.
That is genuinely terrifying.
In a 90-day sprint, you cannot afford to skip the creation of strict VPCs, virtual private clouds, and tight security groups. If you lift and shift your vulnerabilities and pair them with sloppy cloud permissions, you are so much worse off than when you started.
It really underscores why the Pathfinder app we discussed earlier is so critical. You have to figure out how to configure those security groups correctly early on so you aren't doing it in a panic on day 89.
Exactly.
Now, what about the human element? The sources mention that a common mistake is entirely ignoring the people who actually have to run this new system.
Think about what happens on day 91. The 90-day sprint is over. Your physical data center is dark. The engineering team has successfully migrated everything to AWS.
That's the champagne.
Right. But who operates it the next morning? For 20 years, your IT staff managed physical hardware, monitored physical network switches, and managed on-premise capacity.
And suddenly, they're staring at an AWS console.
Yes. If leadership spent all 90 days obsessing over the technical mechanics of data transfer and 0 days upskilling their operations team, the organization will just freeze.
Because they don't know how to monitor the elastic costs, they don't know how to provision a new environment safely, and they definitely don't know how to troubleshoot a serverless function.
Exactly. The operation was a technical success, but the patient dies from operational neglect. A successful 90-day migration requires dedicating at least a portion of that compressed timeline to shadowing, training, and building new operational playbooks for the staff.
So what does this all mean? Let's zoom out and just kind of synthesize this journey. We started with a highly technical, seemingly impossible mandate. moving an entire enterprise IT infrastructure to AWS in 90 days.
And we learned that the secret to surviving isn't just throwing more bodies at the problem.
Right. It's about fundamentally changing the physics of the project. You manage the chaos through the brutal triage of the 7Rs framework, aggressively retiring deadweight, strategically retaining the immovable, and leaning heavily into the ugly, fast lift and shift of rehosting.
While entirely avoiding the perfectionism of refactoring.
Exactly. And in the execution phase, we saw that you have to resist the psychological trap of easy wins. You tackle a complex Pathfinder application early to expose the real architectural bottlenecks.
You deploy automated tools to untangle the hidden dependencies of legacy code so you don't break latency.
And you remain hyper-vigilant about the shared responsibility model, ensuring that the pressure of the clock doesn't result in catastrophic wildcard security permissions. Why does this highly specific cloud scenario matter to you, the listener? Because the mechanics of executing under extreme constraints are universally applicable to the professional world. Whether you are launching a new product line, integrating an acquired company, or overhauling your own operational strategy, the enemy is almost always over-engineering and a lack of forced constraints. This AWS scenario proves that an artificial deadline combined with a rigid framework like triage doesn't just create stress. It acts as a forcing function to cut through corporate bloat and actually deliver results.
I think that is the perfect distillation of the source material, and I would leave you with this final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We just broke down how a massive, entrenched enterprise can completely uproot its foundational technology and migrate to a fully modern cloud reality in just 90 days, largely because they were forced to by an uncompromising deadline. It makes you wonder, if a company can pull off a miracle of IT engineering in 3 months under pressure, what does that say about the millions of dollars and countless hours we waste on 3-year planning committees for our other strategic initiatives? Are we constantly over-engineering our business projects simply because we have the luxury of time?